Just to officially start, welcome everybody to our ongoing virtual brown bag session on ExpandED here at Texas Tech University. This is a virtual brown bag session hosted by, or co-hosted, I should say, by our Educational Leadership Policy Program, as well as the Center for Innovative Research and Change Leadership in Education, which we call CIRCLE. We are very excited to be joined today by Dr. Supriya Baily. Dr. Baily is an activist, a scholar, an educator, as well as, and I'll just say this personally, as a colleague and a friend to me and so many others in the comparative and international education and international education policy communities. Her work began when she was a teenager in India as a community organizer and leader. Currently, she's a professor of education at George Mason University, focusing on social justice issues in education, the marginalization of girls and women in educational policy and practice, and the role of teacher education to address educational inequity. Prior to joining academia, she spent a decade working for development and social justice organizations, cementing her lifelong interest in better understanding the processes of agency and voice that promote grassroots transformation in marginalized communities. She also serves as the co-director for the Center for International Education at George Mason University and is currently the president of the Comparative and International Education Society, where she formerly served as treasurer. She has co-edited 4 books, published numerous articles and book chapters, and has secured nearly $2 million in collaborative grant scholarships. We're so pleased that you're with us today, Dr. Baily, to discuss nationalist agendas and policies of parity and representation in education. Welcome, Dr. Baily.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman. I'm so honored and delighted to be here. And thank you all so much for spending your lunch hour with me. I have a few slides and I'm gonna sort of pull that up really quickly. And we're not starting at the end. So here's where I didn't have my stuff in order. There we go. Hopefully that swift flip through all of them backwards did not give anything away. Thank you for having me, everyone. And I'm really grateful to be able to be here with you all. I planned this for hopefully, 20, 25 minutes, and then really looking forward to conversation and questions and your own thoughts about this. As Dr. Wiseman knows, I've focused for a long time on social justice issues in India primarily, but teacher education issues there. More recently, the last couple of years, I've been working on a book related to the rise of nationalism in South Asia and the ways in which it's impacting middle-class women in one city particularly, but sort of as a case study of what happens when nationalist ideologies take over progressive spaces, especially for women. So this presentation today, actually, you'll all have to excuse me, is sort of more of a work in progress. And so I apologize if it's not completely crafted in this tight package. But what I'm starting to realize is that there's a trend around sort of nationalist, populist, sort of supremacist governments, authoritarian governments, and the ways in which they are chipping away at policies around equity and access in education. And they're doing that in multiple sort of fronts and in different ways. And so I've been trying to investigate I say sort of a lot. I'm trying to investigate, in some ways, explore the ways in which this is represented in certain policies, especially. So that's sort of the plan today. And there we go. So the outline for today's talk is really kind of simple. I want to draw your attention to two policies primarily that you're probably all very familiar with, and one that might be a little newer to you all. I want to sort of frame that around the growth of nationalist ideologies, and then try to present a couple of different ways that these nationalist ideologies are strategizing to affect sort of systems of education that focus on equity and social justice, and how this sort of spans the entire educational spectrum from both the K-12 spaces as well as the higher education spaces. And please feel free at any point of time. This is really informal. So if somebody doesn't feel like they're clear about something or wants to interrupt and ask a question, I can't see the chat at this. I have just one laptop here, so I can't really see the chat and everything, but feel free to just interrupt and ask me anything you'd like to. So what are the two policies that I'm focusing on? So everyone has probably heard of the, affirmative action in the United States. What you might be less familiar with is the Indian reservation policy. If you Google reservation policy, you're probably going to first come up with a whole bunch of things about Native Americans and, U.S. reservation policy. But what the reservation policy in India has done is it's really a quota system. It is a system that tries to redress historical inequities in employment, in education, in public job hiring, spaces like that, which try to then provide access and opportunity for people who've been historically marginalized. This should sound very similar to everyone in terms of how they see affirmative action as well. Again, policy that came out of Lyndon Johnson's administration that paralleled the legal changes that were happening in the post-civil rights movement to be able to, again, positively affect the life trajectories of people who had been historically marginalized. So both of these policies are about 60 to 70 years old. Both of them have worked to sort of elevate people who've been on the margins and have been affirmed, no pun intended, in multiple different spaces and times. So those are the two policies I wanted to particularly start to look at. This is a really dense chart, and I am a qualitative researcher by practice and training. So this, even to me, is a little scary, right? But I thought this was illustrative. I took this from McKinsey and Company, where the headline is really more illustrative than anything else, where it says only 1% of faculty at highly research-intensive institutions are diverse enough that reflect the US population. Which, again, if you look at the trends around affirmative action and you look at the ways in which these are supposed to have helped, especially in educational spaces, what you're not seeing is that same reflection in terms of faculty representation amidst minority or underrepresented populations in higher education institutions. Similarly, this is from Nature, and it's from January 2023, this data. Adivasis are tribal groups, and Dalits are historically what were called untouchables, right? And both of these are the largest populations under which the quota system is supposed to support. If you look over here, this is the line that Adivasis are supposed to reach in terms of the appropriate quota. This is the line over here in 15%, where the Dalits are supposed to reach in terms of representation at, again, as higher education, in higher education institutions as faculty or students and faculty, right? And then when you look at it across the spectrum, you have tribal groups, the Dalits, other backward classes, which is a really reprehensible sort of phrase, but it is the legal phrase of how you define these groups. And then if you look over here, you can see the general population, right? Usually the high caste people. And you can see, like, look, if you look across professors, almost 100% of the proportion of the total are people who make up the high caste groups versus other backward castes, the Dalits and the Adivasis, which is not even present. So again, you can see after 60 or 70 years of the quota system being in place, the structures that exist to keep them out of academic positions continues to be pretty riveting data in some ways, because it doesn't provide us, it doesn't seem to be doing what it's supposed to be doing. Just a quick sidebar illustration, right? So what does the quota system look like in practice? So the city that I do most of my research in is Bangalore, India. And the city itself is divided into 243 wards. And the quota system says even in government representation, these 243 wards elect a representative to the city government offices, right? So they become your local elected representative in the city legislature. So if you have 243 seats, about a third of them are assigned to people from the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, backward tribes group. So about a third of those. And a little less than half are actually are assigned to women. So interestingly enough, when you talk to people about this quota system, suppose I live in neighborhood A, and every 10 years, the census collection determines how many representatives I get from my neighborhood, right? And then they'll determine, okay, this neighborhood gets 5 seats. 2 of them are for women, 1 of them is for a minority candidate, and 2 of them are general. A woman will never run for a general seat. So it almost becomes in some ways segregated seats, that everything that is not a woman's seat becomes a man's seat. And even if it is determined for one of the minority communities, it's still considered a male seat. So that's just an interesting sort of observation over there about how the quota system in some ways really limits people to being in their silos, and there's no assumption. So if I've run for office on the women's side and I win, and then 5 years later they transition that to make it a general seat, it will be highly unlikely that I would run, even if I was a very good representative. And even if I did run, probably the pressure, the public pressure, the private pressure would be too much, and then I wouldn't run. So I'm just going to I think pretty much anyone who's read a newspaper the last couple of years knows that countries as diverse as Brazil, Turkey, the United Nations, not the United Nations, India, United States, and many other European countries are not just flirting anymore with right-wing nationalist groups, but they are in fact electing them. There's an interesting linkage between many of these groups. I think you see this with the United States, and even in Canada, rising misogyny, the incel movement, and a lot of these populist groups aligning their philosophies with greater and greater, more sort of overt forms of misogyny. We can see that, white supremacist movements have become part of mainstream political environment. And in India, the religious connections between Hindu fundamentalists and political power is increasingly growing. So, again, I think if you are watching the news, you're looking at papers, you're seeing things, you're seeing however these groups are defining the other, they're often dehumanized, defranchised, and devalued. Just a couple of charts. I'm sort of in this sort of chart mode these days, it feels like, but again, interesting data, right? These next 3 charts I've taken from the Pew Research Center. In India, Hindus saying that being Hindu is very important to being truly Indian, which is interesting because India has always been considered a secular country. And from its time of independence. If you look at the United States, similarly, 4 in 10 adults say that the country should be a Christian nation. There is that line between, though, having politics invade sort of public spaces, so you've got this data down here, which says, should churches and other houses of worship stay in or out of political matters? So that still leans to more staying out. But again, if you look at this, 60% think that the founders originally thought the United States was a Christian nation. Should it be a Christian nation? That's sort of more split. And they don't think it is now a Christian nation. So that I thought was that was interesting. Similarly, if we want to look at Europe, this is sort of the populist parties thrive on the ability to tell people that the past was much better than the present. And so if you look at how people who think the past was better also tend to have a more favorable view of political parties that are considered more right-wing or more populist in nature. Just going to stop for a second over there and just sort of, I've provided a lot of background in a really concise amount of time. Is there anything that seemed unclear or that I might want to clarify?
I'm going to take this opportunity to butt in, and maybe if others are thinking, they can follow me. When you were talking about gender in particular just now, I wondered how non-binary plays into gender issues in India. I think I have a feel a little bit for how it doesn't play into US considerations as much, but what's it like in India?
So this is a really interesting layered question. In one sense, India has had for many years traditionally a belief in sort of the third gender. There have been groups of people who have and the traditional word escapes me right at this moment, but there is a group of, there's a class of people who are considered third gender, who are in some ways very recognized as part of the Hindu culture and part of the Indian context. But when you look at people who might identify in modern parlance as LGBTQ plus, there is resistance over there, that in itself. So if it falls under the domains that this is a cultural practice that has existed for a long time, there is a sense of inclusion there. But when you look at it as being able to express, your gender through sort of more what would be considered Western notions of what that is, it's less, there's far less tolerance, if in fact any. Any other clarifications or questions? Did that provide some context, Dr. Wiseman?
That was helpful.
So again, as we sort of frame this work, we recognize that, there is a, so one of the things that has been written about as why the rise of the nationalist movements has sort of come to a head right now has been one of the hypotheses is that it's a backlash against globalization. It's been a backlash against sort of this notion that people, the world is one, that we are able to sort of move our jobs, move our lives, engage across barriers, that cultural exchange has become something that has become much more of has been perceived much more as a threat. These are some quotes, and I can share the sources if people would want them, but white nationalists really sort of feel that since the 1960s, the continued sort of dispossession that they've experienced has been one of the reasons that people don't feel like their children are going to have as secure a future as they did. And so there's sort of that growing sort of uncertainty to the growing uncertainty that leads to in the perceptions of insecurity. And in India, this is, the Hindu-Muslim tensions have always existed from the time of independence. The country was built on the fact that, as the British left, they divided the country based off of technically religious lines. But really, India had always sort of made the decision to try to be a secular country. But the electoral victories of the BJP has been working since independence, really, in other variations of itself, to really work towards trying to ensure a majority and building upon the fact that they really believe that India should be a Hindu nation. And the perception, the sort of the language that is being used constantly tends to be, how do we protect ourselves from them? So the system, so in light of the current context of the rising nationalist movements and the ideologies that are percolating political spaces more and more overtly over time, there have been clear efforts to try to attack both the systems of affirmative action and the reservation system. And all fronts have been used in this matters, right? So legal, economic, social, and cultural. In the United States, there was this initial sort of pushback against affirmative action, saying this is big government. We really shouldn't have the government imposing on how people are selected for jobs. How do we monitor this? How do we rectify this? There should be this, this policy goes against sort of our notion of small government. Furthermore, there's been greater conversations around the impact of reverse discrimination. How do I, as a person who has done what I need to do, now I don't get to benefit from the system because, somebody's going to give them that job or whatever it is. The other piece of this has been the other sort of way in which minds have been sort of sought to be changed is, well, this happened 150 years ago. This isn't my fault. I didn't own slaves. I didn't do something. So therefore, I don't understand why I need to pay the price to help those people move up the ladder. And so that has been another sort of argument that has worked well with people. Others have said, look how well we've done. We have Barack Obama, we have Colin Powell, we have Oprah Winfrey, we've all these people. Well, why do we need to do anything more? They're already succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. And I use they and we very, very specifically over here. So we, what's the purpose of continuing to have these policies that are expensive, that are hard to monitor, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the other piece of this that talks about, well, then we're lowering standards. If you're not really qualified to get this job, or you're really not really qualified to go to this university, then we're lowering the standards of those universities or those jobs and things like that. In India, it's slightly different. It is actually considered political suicide to talk about the reservation system, and it has been for a long time because the numbers are so vast, right? Because in some places you're looking at, like in higher education, sometimes the reservation and quota system can go up to 59%. So that's a huge population of people who fall under these categories. So really, political parties tend to be a little more careful. But instead, the way they're working at it is they're asking those questions. Is it working? So the chart that I showed you a couple of slides ago shows that in some ways, the system isn't working. It's been 70 years. This isn't really helping the people it's meant to help. So maybe we should just get rid of it and do something else. So that sort of doubt that gets placed in people's mind becomes very effective. Again, the caste system is so deeply ingrained in the Indian psyche. We've got cases, if you Google tech companies in Silicon Valley, there have been cases there where Indians in tech companies have ensured that people who are of different castes are not provided the same promotions and things like that. So California, in fact, is actually looking at whether or not caste should be one of the areas that they shouldn't, people shouldn't discriminate against. But it really, it reiterates deeply held biases and stereotypes which exist, right? But on the flip side of this is that the middle class is almost 300 or 400 million people right now in India. And flip side, is that they have tended never to vote. So they've been incredibly apathetic. So after independence and things like that, these big parties were really going after the farmer vote, the rural vote, and the minority vote. And so people just ignored the middle class. But what has changed over the last 2 decades is that political parties, especially the BJP, have tapped into this as a voter bank and have said, look at how bad your lives are. You don't have good electricity, and there's, we don't have public restrooms and things like that. And so they've tapped into some key areas that make Indians very unhappy with their country and feel like that's why they don't have sort of the same pride as other people do in their country. And so they really aim to go after them. And as a result, they're benefiting from sort of these hundreds and hundreds of millions of voters. And the other part of this is that the upper castes are starting to consolidate power and positions in their own versions of sort of the mythical sort of deep state in the US, but they're actually sort of identifying positions and putting people in those jobs without having to go through the traditional sort of quota employment system. So just to kind of, I think none of this is probably new to many of you. You're all international education policy people. So, I just want to draw a couple of headlines from the United States, a couple of headlines from India, and then sort of say, okay, where do we think this is going? Everyone's probably very well aware of the fact that, the Supreme Court is looking at affirmative action. Here in Virginia, you've probably got these in Texas as well, probably really do. I mean, these magnet schools that draw students from all over to apply, STEM schools. Here in Virginia, we're looking at sort of a battle at the Thomas Jefferson School of Science and Technology, which is one of the premier STEM schools in the country, where Asian American they've had populations of Hispanic and Black students that are under 5% from year to year to year. And so for the last couple of years, they've been trying to figure out, how do we open up the school to populations of students who have historically not been able to get in. But you see sort of this twist on this, right? The war on merit is become the language that people are using around how to sort of elevate the issue, but also not make it sound like they are marginalizing Black and brown communities. And then there's the additional piece of this of creating division within different groups of color, right? So encompassing Asian Americans as being said, look, nobody's considering your, minority status. Nobody is giving you enough credit for how hard you've worked and how well you, sort of try to support your students and your children. And so therefore, this is about not supporting you. In India, you see different headlines where there have been structural ways in which the government has sought to make life, as the headline says, more difficult for students. Scholarship money programs are being slashed or are just being ignored, so that students who are supposed to get access to these funds are not getting that. Different programs that help minority students access education are being discontinued. And I mean, just across a whole different front, if it's something that's supposed to help minority students, you are seeing that, in fact, being played out in higher education. The good thing is that, in some ways, these are playing out in the media, right? They're being, journalists are writing stories about them, but there's a whole other narrative around the ways in which journalists are being threatened and muzzled. So that's a different story. So we're not going to go down that path today. But if you look at all of these, this is, February 5th, January 31st, January 31st. So these are things that have happened within the last week. So it's actually very present and very real. I don't know how many of you have played recreational sports. My kids played soccer and were terrible at it. But, as a parent, like I was perfectly happy spending one morning a week, hanging out at the soccer field, a couple of, watching a game, and then one night a week doing practice. But the moment I saw these parents who are into travel, and no offense to anyone who has the stomach for, travel sports, I didn't. But you start to have the privilege that comes with higher quality coaches, better facilities, more money involved. So, you get better, right? The more practice you have, the better resources you have. So what is your natural acumen? Like, what can what can you do because you have achieved it versus what can you do because you have access to it versus what can you do if you are lucky enough to have a privileged sort of path to get to where you're getting to. And so these are starting to be pitted against each other in these nationalist ideologies, where access is no longer something that has to be opened up. It really is, and sorry, this is where my arguments are a little fuzzy still, right? So you'll have to all work with me on this. But merit and access and privilege, and I just sort of see those as a triangle where you're not, each person who's coming into the space might have one of those as an access point, but because of this willingness to keep things to yourself, you want to remove the access as much as possible. The idea of divide and conquer over here comes back to the fact that if we're pitting groups against each other, they're not looking at sort of the hegemonic powers that oversee the structures. So if you have Asians, upset with Blacks and Hispanics, you have, Muslims and sort of the lower caste, the other caste communities fighting with each other, then nobody's going to turn around and say, well, let's rethink this. The other piece of this is the growing engagement of political parties in educational practices. Yes, education's always been a place for political engagement. But what I think over the last 30 years, you might have seen political parties talking about maybe supporting teachers or pay raises or sort of very nebulous things because they've wanted to stay relatively in the middle, right? You didn't sort of come right out and attack curriculum or sort of parental engagement in schools. There's so many different fronts now where nationalist ideologies and political parties are definitely much more savvy to in terms of figuring how to wedge those issues in order to bolster up their political fortunes. And finally, I would just say, this isn't a question that I think that we have. I think we all know the answers to this final question, but caste and race preferences are just so fraught, especially in times of where we feel threatened, we feel like resources are slim to non-existent. And so it just becomes a space that when you're already struggling to make your voice heard, it becomes even harder to have the ability to step through that into a better place. So I sort of stopped there because I think I'm rambling at this point in time, but I hope that, maybe I'll stop screen sharing and just want to say, thank you all for listening. And I hope that this spurred some thinking or maybe was helpful at all.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. I wish these are the times when I wish we were all in the same room because we would applaud. And I know we can do that through the reactions somehow. But thank you so much, Supriya. That was really, really very interesting and very thought-provoking. I have a lot of questions. I have a whole sheet of things I wrote down while you're talking that I'd love to talk about. But I did want to encourage the folks that are here. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. You can, if you're not comfortable just turning your mic on and talking, you can raise your hand using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure that you know, you get a chance. Or you can just butt in. That's fine. So to give folks maybe a chance to figure out how they want to contribute, and people, you probably know this about Supriya. I know some of the people in here have had me in a class, and I'm very bad at wait time. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask a question.
If they've had you in class, they also know that you can be intimidating, so they shouldn't leave me to, like, you know, have to like just address your questions only as well.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should
No,
just be
I
quiet now.
tease.
I'm
I
not that
tease.
intimidating. I'm a nice
No,
guy.
you're not, in a good way. I want to rise to the occasion.
Okay, all right. So I'm kind of stuck on gender, and I know that wasn't the main sort of focus of this discussion, and it certainly doesn't feed into the nationalism part as much, but it's what I have in my head to hook some of these concepts on. So I'm interested in the ways that you have seen, maybe in India compared to the US, the whole idea of meritocracy being used as a way to justify inequality. You know, sometimes there's the argument that as long as there's a, you know, basic level of access there, then, you know, people should be able to, you know, pull up their bootstraps or whatever the saying is, and, you know, they have an opportunity to make it their own. And I think that can be used as a way to further draw those lines of division. And when we start talking about like who deserves to, you know, succeed in education or have those spots at the elite, you know, universities of technology or whatever it might be, sometimes that idea of meritocracy can be used in those arguments. Do you see that in the Indian context as well as the US context, or is that the wrong path?
It's a really thoughtful question. And maybe I might be misunderstanding it, so just interrupt if I am. The gender piece of this is, I think, directly linked to nationalism and populism. I don't think it's a peripheral issue. I think separately, I think that the narrative around nationalism is one that tries to reify and return to historic norms of what gender needs to be, which is why then you also ignore sort of non-binary populations because they don't fit into traditional expectations of what a man's role in society is versus a woman's role in society. And nationalist ideologies, I think those people who tend to be convinced by nationalist populist ideologies tend to also be people who believe strongly in those traditional notions of male versus female. And that's women too, right? Who believe that, you know, this is the way society should be shaped. In terms of the meritocracy piece, the Indian reservation system does require women to be one of the quota groups, right? So if an engineering college, for instance, is admitting students after 12th grade into an engineering program, they do have to meet the quotas for male, female, and the minority communities. What happens, though, I think, is in certain spaces, they try to open that it's not monitored to the effect of how many women are in the cardiology program, but it could be that there are a number of women who've been accepted into the psychology program or the psychiatry program, or there's a number of women who've been identified and moved into the dermatology program. You know, again, no offense to the level of training a dermatologist needs, but it's interesting that, you know, it's still easy to sort of within those buckets move populations around based on what you think is ultimately their value or how much you value that. I think that's the same thing in the United States, right? I mean, we look at engineering programs and we still see gaps between women in CS, computer science programs versus maybe a softer engineering program. And yet, if the numbers that are being reported are just sort of for the engineering school, and this comes back to the work that Hatla and I have done on parity and quality, is that if we're only going to measure how many women are in an engineering program, we're not really getting at, are they in the programs that maybe are more higher paying when they finish or are, whatever. I don't know if this is answering your question about the meritocracy piece of it, but I do think that the structures and systems that exist, especially in India, continue to sort of operate at the level, the most general level that they can, because there's still a very deep-rooted belief that there's not a necessity for women to be in certain spaces.
That's really interesting and really helpful. I have more to say, but there's a question.
I see one in the chat, right? Yeah. Raina is asking about merit-based school programs. So I guess, Raina, if I can maybe give you the context of this program in Virginia as the example that I used, right? It used to be a test-based program. You needed teacher recommendations, you needed Algebra 2, and you needed to do a test to be admitted into TJ, as it's commonly called over here. What happens over the last 25 years is that those students who left TJ would immediately almost be offered university position, admission to some of the best university programs in the country, just by nature of where they were. But they also drew primarily kids who were white and Asian American. And they were coming out of feeder middle schools that were designed in some ways to ensure that their students were ready for the test, that teachers were confident about how to write recommendation letters for their students because the parent demand was there. In our area, I know that there are kids who are South Asian or East Asian who've been taking TJ prep courses since they were in 2nd and 3rd grade to get into TJ. With the population of Hispanic and Black students being so incredibly low, the county started to say this is a problem because this doesn't track with our percentages of Hispanic and Black families in the school district. And we have to sort of try to figure out how we can help those students because they're not being given TJ prep courses from the time they were in 2nd or 3rd grade. That they are not, their parents often don't even know if their kids are smart enough that there is this opportunity for them. And the structure of the school was in such a way that, pick up and drop off. I mean, it was just really hard for parents who didn't have unlimited resources at their disposal. So I say all this just to say that, so the push became that maybe every middle school in the county should have a percentage of their students come to TJ as a result. So not so much the weight on the tests, not so much the weight on the teacher recommendations, but that there was better representation from across all the middle schools versus 5 middle schools sort of, have sort of the monopoly on the school. And that became the problem, right? Because it was, how is it merit? And philosophically, I asked the question, how do we ensure that we're looking at merit as widely as we can if there are students who don't have the same opportunities from the time they were very, very young to be able to benefit that, right? You did. And again, see, this is why it becomes really personal for people, because each person's journey to get into that 7th grade classroom to be able to take that test is a little bit different. I'm just responding to Raina's comment over there. It's a little different, right? And so it's not easy to make a decision, a policy decision about how you make a school like this more inclusive and more open to students who might be able to do very well on that test, but haven't had the same preparation to get to that point. And so rather than addressing this issue as, let's figure out how to make our high schools more inclusive or more challenging, or how do we get more 7th grade students or 8th grade students across the board ready to be able to take on more challenging courses because they want to, it became about limiting. It became seen as limiting certain populations from being able to access the school, predominantly Asian American families. And I'm trying to really, I recognize the sensitivity on many levels over here, and which is why it makes it an interesting policy case, right? Because whose interests matter, and how are those interests translated when resources are limited?
Really good, really interesting. Thank you, Raina, for your question as well. Other questions? I get extended by an hour with all my comments and questions, so I'm gonna.
I got nothing else going on this afternoon.
I got wait time. I'm gonna try wait time here for a second. I'm not sure I can make it. Oh, there's another one. Do you know how many college students admitted to schools with affirmative action programs actually were retained? How many graduated?
No, that's a very good question. No, I don't, Raina. No. I'm sure that the US government has that data somewhere, and I'm sure that accreditation programs might be looking at some of that, or especially if you're looking around equity issues. But I mean, this could be historical. I mean, and I don't know, Alex, maybe you can help me with this. I mean, in the sense that, my understanding of how affirmative action looks in higher education is that we're looking across a broad diversity to ensure there's representation in our classes versus just admitting people purely on sort of race or gender, or in race or ethnicity issues, right? I mean, it's supposed to be one factor that you take into account versus the only factor that you take into account.
I believe you. This is not my area of specialization. I'm sorry. We had our department chair was on a little earlier. I'm sure he had a meeting he had to go to because he dropped off, but I think he would know. I think just to build on that a little bit, one of the things that really interests me is this sort of difference between access and maybe the quality of the experience. And again, I'm not a higher education expert, so I'm thinking more of K-12 schooling, but there can be very broad access provided, like open enrollment. And there's still going to be some problems with, getting there and having the school uniforms or whatever it would take to be in school. And I'm sure that's true also for higher ed. But the quality of the curriculum, of the educators that are working in school, of the facilities, of the everything else can vary dramatically based on geographic location, the predominant gender or racial or ethnic community that attends a particular educational institution. And so in some of the work that I've done previously, and it's not as recent as your work, so mine's probably outdated, but we were really interested in this difference between sort of the performative part of access, national education systems being able to say, oh, we have 100% enrollment. But when you really look at what the education that was available to different groups based along these lines, it was remarkably different. And as a result, their outcomes were remarkably different. And some of them, just to be depressing, it all just ended up being reproduction of inequality. but I'm assuming some of that is the same, regardless of the nationalist agenda at play here. Maybe it's always like that. So.
Yeah, no, I think that, it's resources in versus, resources out. And
yeah,
that you're right. Even so to give you an example, this is different, but India has also constituted another quota policy called the not education for all. Anyway, this different policy, which I can pull out in just a second, identifies private schools are a huge piece of Indian public education. Like 50% of schools are fee-based. And they decided about 10 years ago that 25% of each school, 25% of the admissions to the first grade classroom would have to be students from economically backward environments, right? So that included sort of these minority groups plus people whose income levels were under a threshold. And private schools would have to take them, whether they were, the prestigious Doon School, which educated for prime ministers, to the little local private school that, somebody started 25 years ago and now has, K through 12. And so they would have to take 0.25% of, so the fees would be shortened by 25% because they would have to take these students. But they only had to provide them a free education up to the age of 14. But most of the exams happened at the age of 15 and a half or 16. And so some schools were like, you know what, we're in this, we believe in equity, we're going to keep these kids right up till they graduate with their board exams and they can move off. Other schools were like, you know what, we don't have enough money and we're not getting any money from these kids. So we're going to send them off at 14 and they're going to have to go back to their local public school, which is often very underfunded and, has really poor quality teaching. And so what these kids were getting were, even in some of the best schools in the city, they were putting them into sections that were only the 25% together, and they had a lower quality teacher and they weren't provided access to the resources that the other kids had. So I think, ultimately the ways in which we as people try to continue to marginalize people who have the least is sort of what to me is the idealist in me gets really disappointed with that. But you're right. I think that the resources piece and the outcomes piece here are linked to the ability for people to have the kind of experiences that other kids would have. Sorry, really long answer to a simple question.
Great answer, Supriya. I love it. We only have a few minutes left, and we've got the faithful few here who I know that you guys have real lives and jobs. I know at least two of the names that are still on here, and I know they work full time and they're busy. So I appreciate you guys being here. Any last questions or comments from anyone before we sign off?
Thank you, Carolyn. It was wonderful to be here. Thank you, Raina.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just want to talk.
I just want to remind everyone real quick, if you wanted to look at this later or share it with someone else, this is being recorded. The version of this will be that trims out all the stuff before we started and maybe after we end up talking. Will be available on our ExpandED website and also on YouTube. So if you want to hear Dr. Baily again or share this with others, please just look for it there. And thank you so much for joining us, Supriya. It has been really fantastic hearing about your work and your perspective, and we look forward to where you're taking this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.